Hello everyone and welcome back yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Sorry for this late start here, a little bit of technical issues. I am working with a new laptop. It is its debut, so bear with me if any problems ensue throughout the show, but we go on as we have to do here in this kind of business. But for our Monday show, we should have a great show ahead for you guys today. Starting off with a Monday Night Football preview, a game between the Bills and Jets with huge AFC East implications. Going to go over my fantasy stars of both the NFL and college football weekends. Going to be doing my bold fantasy predictions, my don't be surprised if segment, if you will. And I'll round it off starting with my positional rankings with the QBs. But before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you all yet again that if you do feel so inclined, like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network for more short content from us. It's not just all about the podcast. We do have short content there for you guys to enjoy. Small videos that we post talking about our shows. But if you do want to interact and contribute to the show more directly throughout its duration, please make yourselves available to the Super Chat. Wrong kind of image there. Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. They're a great way to interact with the show and the network as a whole here, and they also make the show much better, your interactions and comments here. But without further ado, let's jump right into today's show here. 1 second. I do want to, there we go, so you can see my face. Sorry about that to those who did not see it. But without further ado, let's jump right into today's show, starting off with our Monday Night Football preview here between the Bills and the Jets. It's a massive game, like I said, huge AFC East implications. Winner takes first place. Now, this is a game that, in terms of both of these teams, is going to tell us a lot about how they're going to project for the rest of the season, especially into the postseason as well. Let's start off with the Bills, though, in this game before we get into any betting previews. Let's preview the teams playing this game as well. Let's start off with the Bills. The Bills have generally looked like one of the NFL's sneakiest teams in terms of putting together the best performances we've seen out of anyone in the AFC, but they've also put together some stinkers as well, including stinkers from their QB, Josh Allen, which we've seen before. We've seen kind of this narrative surrounding Josh Allen and what he brings to this team week in, week out, whether it be superhero-like performances or performances where he's not performing up to his lofty standards. And so that's kind of where this iteration of the Bills stands after 5 or so weeks. And they come into tonight's game, yes, as the presumptive AFC East favorite. But if they lose this game, they certainly can, because not for nothing they are banged up. I feel like a lot of luster surrounding this team is going to be lost. And I feel like the hope and optimism surrounding what we saw early on from the Bills was that Josh Allen didn't have to do too much. Now, though, with a lot of offensive injuries in this system, you're now seeing Josh Allen becoming a little bit of a shell of himself in certain moments. Without certain players, he simply has not been performing up to par, and that has led to the detriment of this team. For example, a couple weeks ago against Baltimore, when he loses his top receiver, Khalil Shakir, to injury, he doesn't necessarily look like himself. So this game is highly integral to see which kind of version of Josh Allen we are going to get. Are we going to get the guy who can deliver now, or are we going to get the guy who is going to underperform yet again on the biggest stages? On the Jet side of things, perhaps the craziest week so far of any footballing organization in the NFL. Firing Robert Saleh, hiring Jeff Ulbrich, their former defensive coordinator, as the interim head coach, and then him demoting Nathaniel Hackett, kind of stripping him of his play calling duties and promoting quarterbacks coach Todd Downing to play calling and technically offensive coordinator duties himself. So this whole kind of narrative surrounding this iteration of the New York Jets is one of weirdness, one of tension, perhaps one of turmoil that we weren't necessarily predicting to start the season. To start the season, we were kind of predicting that the Jets would be in and around the AFC East, if not playoff race in the AFC. We weren't predicting that it would come in such a weird manner because, yes, if they win this game, they are first place in the AFC East. But at what cost will it come to this team? Because if you want my opinion about this move, as we get a comment here from Will Casper. Welcome to the show, Will Casper. Talking about his fantasy football team. I am 5-0 and have a lot of wide receivers with Amon-Ra, St. Brown, Cooper Kupp, Jaden Reed, Mike Evans, Brandon Ayuk, and Tank Dell. He's asking if he wants to trade Mike Evans and Jaden Reed for Tyreek. If not, I have to keep 3 of those guys on my bench. Well, I feel like that trade is a non-starter because Mike Evans and Jaden Reed right now actually have quarterbacks. And Tyreek Hill does not. And I have no hope in the Dolphins' offense if there's no sort of consistent quarterback play to supplement it. So that being said, I think that this is a trade that you should not go through with. I think you need the wide receiver depth going forward, especially with all the injuries at the position, because you never know when you're going to need a guy who's a solid replacement for you. So keeping both Evans and Reed, who A, get perhaps the most targets on their respective teams, and B, actually have competent quarterback play, would be wise of you. I feel like going out and getting Tyreek is not that, important for the outlook of your wide receiver room. I understand that you might want to kind of push away the quote-unquote dead weight, but I find having an overload at one certain position important should that position be ravaged by injury. So that's just my advice to you, but good luck to you in this trade and in your fantasy football exploits, my friends, and welcome to the show, Will, as he has awesome. Thanks, man. I appreciate it. Thank you, Will, for your comment. But getting back to this Monday Night Football game, let's talk about the Jets a little bit more. I kind of feel like, not for nothing, this move could project to be positive because it could have been Robert Saleh that was holding this team back because we didn't necessarily see the spark and creativity we wanted out of the Jets' offense early on. We saw a lot of inconsistencies, and we saw that Aaron Rodgers struggled getting the football to certain star players already there. Yes, he's worked in Allen Lazard pretty well into this offense, and he's liking Mike Williams and his importance to this team. But I kind of feel like it limits this offense when it's going through certain players. If you can't get Garrett Wilson going, then you're not unlocking the best parts of your offense. If you can't get the run game going, most importantly, the protection for Aaron Rodgers weakens week in, week out. And so that's why I feel like the Jets needed a cultural change, needed an identity shift, but demoting Nathaniel Hackett, if you're the Jets organization, kind of feels a little bit not necessarily the best of decisions because that's Aaron Rodgers' guy, but I get it. You kind of need to change something about how the offensive approach is looking. And if it's demoting Nathaniel Hackett, then so be it. But I kind of feel like that's a little bit harsh this early in the season. Yes, we've seen time in time out that Nathaniel Hackett can't work with certain players, but if he's the key to unlocking Aaron Rodgers, then you need to kind of keep him around. Yes, I kind of get that sentiment, but overall, that's just my opinion on it. But let's get into the general betting consensus and most importantly, my pick for this game. The Jets are actually 2.5-point favorites at home, and kudos to MetLife Stadium for hosting 2 consecutive primetime games for this season. Kudos to them. Over-under 40.5. New York Jets plus 115. Buffalo minus 135 to win this game. So as you can see, a little bit of discrepancy between the Jets being favorites and the money lines for this game as well. But overall, if you are asking for my personal pick in this game, I'm leaning Jets here. And the reason why is this. When I look at the Buffalo Bills, I see a team that, as of right now, knows that its best football comes from health. And this is not a healthy football team right now on either side of the football. We haven't even talked about both of these teams' defenses, and the Bills one is the most ravaged out of these two teams. You have no such depth in your linebacker room outside of the two guys you have injured. You lost Matt Milano for this season as well, so that's a non-starter. Your secondary is very much devastated with injuries. And then when you go to the offense, James Cook could be out for tonight's game. Khalil Shakir has been injured this season. And so you add all of these things up, and it leads me to wonder how the Bills can sustain what they're trying to build under Joe Brady if there's no kind of health and consistency in this roster. On the Jets side of things, yes, you have to wonder how they'll look in the first place with the new head coach and the new play caller on the offensive side of the football, but there's just a little bit more optimism to them if you actually think about it, because they diagnosed a problem that they had, and we're going to have to find out and see if that problem was the correct problem to diagnose tonight. But being proactive about it shows that the Jets want something out of the season, and they're taking advantage before their most important game of the season to date. A lot of people might call it weird, but I call it as it is. It's a move to get you prepared to contend, because right now, I don't think that Jets team could have contended this game or played well in this game with Robert Saleh. And I think that we're going to see that similar reaction in the Jets players playing more freely in tonight's game, taking advantage of a very decimated Bills roster. But that's just my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments. But coming up next, we're going to be talking about my NFL Fantasy Stars of the Week, and a lot of different guys having good games that I want to get to. So we'll be right back after this short break. Do not go anywhere.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day here, I do want to remind you yet again that if you do feel so inclined throughout the show, if you want to interact more directly, making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube is the best way to do it. You can contribute in many different ways. You can click the $, leave a tip or donation, or you can just leave a comment if you want to interact with the show. But anything you leave is greatly appreciated by me, my fellow podcasters, and all our shows, and especially the network as a whole, and it just makes it that much better. But without further ado, let us jump right into our second segment of today's show, talking about some of the fantasy stars of the week here. Now, all of these fantasy stars are players that either really stepped up this week or are proven to be some of the best at their respective positions this season in fantasy terms. Now, some of these guys are first-time appearances on the list, and some of these guys already are stalwarts of this list. It's that time of the season where guys in fantasy just separate themselves from the pack, and you really know who's who. So without further ado, let's jump right into them. Starting off with the quarterback position, this guy is making his first appearance on one of my lists, and I'm glad to see him here. He's been steadily improving week in, week out. The rookie quarterback sensation, going abroad in London, beating quote-unquote London team in the Jacksonville Jaguars, let alone that. So, without further ado, Caleb Williams, as we have to go to the end to get to him, is my fantasy QB star of the week. 23 of 29 passing, 226 yards, 4 touchdowns, and most importantly, 28.64 fantasy points. This game kind of represented the improvements we've seen from Caleb Williams. At the start of the season, he was a little bit timid, wasn't necessarily making good decisions in the pocket, wasn't necessarily working well outside of structure, wasn't really trusting his offensive line, which had its issues throughout the season. But as we've seen him go on, as we've seen him improve and trust this deep wide receiver core, we've seen magical things out of Caleb that we expected when he was selected first overall. And this game in London, his first ever trip abroad, he played perhaps his best game as a starter in the NFL. Yes, it was against the Jacksonville Jaguars, and I get that. But this is kind of the game that we were all expecting Caleb Williams to have kind of at the start of the season. But even though we've gotten it a couple of weeks after the fact, it's still a performance that we can lay our kind of bets on in saying that Caleb Williams will just show steady improvement week in, week out for this team. And so I'm looking forward to more performances like this from him, looking forward to seeing if he finds his place onto this list more consistently, but he is my fantasy QB star of the week. At the running back position, we saw a little bit, going back here in my graphic, to Derrick Henry, a familiar face here on this list in this segment, coming in as my fantasy running back star of the weekend. And in this game, a game that was perhaps the most exciting of the weekend to many NFL fans, Derrick Henry proved why he is now becoming one of the focal points of the Baltimore Ravens offense. 24 carries, 132 yards, 2 touchdowns, 25.2 fantasy points for Derrick Henry in this game. And just going to show that, let alone being someone who I personally thought was not going to be a star for the Baltimore Ravens just because of the fact that I like their more committee approach, he has proved every single pundit who distrusted this move wrong. And he's really proven that he has been someone who the Baltimore Ravens can rely upon for long periods of the season whenever they're in trouble. And I really think that going forward, Derrick Henry is someone who I'm excited to see progress in this team, because there will be games in the AFC North and in the playoffs in which Derrick Henry is going to have to be very multifaceted and certainly going to have a lot of questions asked of him. Now, what we've seen from him at the start of the season is otherworldly, but that's where I feel like a lot of doubts will seep in. That's where the caveats will be when we think of Derrick Henry in this offense. But just looking at this game against the Commanders, the toughest opponent to date for them outside of perhaps the Buffalo Bills, in this game, he's proving why the Baltimore Ravens trusted him out of any other running back on their team, being free to let go of Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins and acquire Derrick Henry, and is justifying every step of the way. So I'm looking forward to seeing more out of him in this Baltimore Ravens offense, because it's becoming one of the best offenses in the league yet again, much like last season. So the sky's the limit for how many appearances my man Derrick Henry will make on this list. But coming in as my fantasy wide receiver of this week, this is a guy who last year a lot of fantasy football managers may have been a little bit disappointed by or let down by. He is someone, though, who at the end of the day is still a very valuable wide receiver 2, wide receiver 1 hybrid sometimes, but can get the job done any given week for you, and that is my man Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We always knew that Chris Godwin was always a vital piece of this Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense, but the question was, can he become more consistent in the level of performances he has across a 17-game season. And thus far, he has outshined my wildest expectations for him. 11 receptions, 125 yards, 2 touchdowns in this game against the New Orleans Saints, picking up a much-needed NFC South victory for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. 35.5 fantasy points for him as well, so not too shabby. But just seeing the contrast from Chris Godwin, kind of at the start of the season last year, throughout the season, into this season, just seeing the progress he's made as the wide receiver 2 in Tampa, just seeing how he's become so multifaceted, become so integral to the makeup of this Bucs offense, being that kind of intelligent, high IQ wide receiver the Bucs can always rely upon when things go awry. I've really grown to appreciate him from last season, because last season he was on my fantasy team and didn't really put together many consistent performances for me. But over the past couple of weeks, he's had consistent performances for the Bucs, supplementing Mike Evans so well at the wide receiver position that I'm really excited to see through a whole season if he can maintain that certain level that we've seen out of him. Because if he can, he's certainly the most exciting wide receiver 2 option you can find on the fantasy market if you are looking for that kind of guy. But this game and other games in the NFC South for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers will go to prove why Chris Godwin is just a tier above some of those guys in that division. He's the difference maker, whereas other teams can't necessarily seem to find a wide receiver 2 as consistent as a guy like Chris Godwin in that division. So that's why he's such an important fantasy player as well, because in divisional games, he's more of a difference maker than any other wide receiver in the NFC South, because he's such a consistent wide receiver 2. And that's why he's my fantasy wide receiver star of the week, for his performances in those divisional games. Hopefully we get to see more out of him in these divisional games throughout the year. My last player that I want to go over is one of my fantasy stars of the weekend. It's a tight end, actually. A guy who actually contributed to this game in so many different ways, not just as a tight end, but as a long snapper as well. Multi-faceted player, kind of a guy going under the radar on my personal fantasy football team that I want to shout out. How about Mr. Cole Kmet? I apologize for this graphic. It should say the Chicago Bears, not the Penn State Indian Lions. That should foreshadow my college football fantasy stars of the weekend, if you will. But talking about Cole Kmet, 5 receptions, 70 yards, 2 touchdowns. Just a guy who sneakily could emerge in the top 10 of tight ends in fantasy when it's all said and done at the end of the season. He's someone who might not get the big yardage totals like the Kelce's and Kittles of the world, or the touchdown totals like the Fergusons and perhaps Schultz's of the world. But he is someone who warrants a look at, because in the red zone is where he's most potent. He's certainly not going to get the most targets out of anyone in this team, but he certainly is someone who is going to get meaningful targets as a tight end for the Chicago Bears. Because, yes, you look at the wide receiver room and you see a lot of depth there, and you don't necessarily see the potential for a guy like Cole Kmet to get many receptions or many targets as well. But when he does, it translates into effective fantasy output for you. He's not someone who you kind of have to go week in, week out and kind of orient his matchups as you see fit. He's someone who, yes, you're not reliant on as much as top tier tight ends, but at the end of the day, he gets you the job done. And not for nothing, even in such a volatile market, he's someone who's kind of the constant in this kind of weird tier of guys trying to separate themselves from tiers 3 and 4. I think he's kind of in the middle tier there, but this performance goes to show that he can still have effective performances for you in real life and fantasy, if you so choose. But that should just about do it for this segment. Let me know what you think in the comments. who your fantasy stars of the weekend might have been. These are just mine. I might want to hear your opinions as well. You are welcome to leave them. But coming up on the other side, we transition from the NFL to college football for just a little bit, as we are going to talk about my college football fantasy stars of the weekend. Like I said, I foreshadowed. Sorry about that graphic change there, mishap there, because the Penn State Nittany Lions are not an NFL team, but there's a player from the Penn State Nittany Lions that I want to mention in my next segment. We'll be right back to talk about that, so don't go anywhere, because we'll be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you enjoyed the first 2 segments. We are going to take a little bit of a break from NFL talk for just a little while and transition into the wild world of college football. Talking about some fantasy college football. If there are any fantasy college football fans, make yourselves known in the chat. I would love to hear your opinions on this segment. But these are my personal fantasy stars of the week. And we actually have 5 here for the college football weekend. And it was a wacky one in that certain things went to plan, but there were some performances that I'm going to mention that were excellent in their own right, but also left room for improvement. And what I mean by that is all these performances here are from players who generally were integral to their team winning. But that doesn't mean that there were mistakes made by these players that could be improved upon as the season goes on, especially some who are vying for the CFC spots, because there are some top 25 contenders and there are some CFP contenders in here as well I'm going to be talking about. So without further ado, let's break each and every single one of them down. Starting off with the QB position, this was kind of a tough weekend to pick QBs because some of the top QBs were on bye weeks, such as Cam Ward, and the Dylan Gabriel performance I did not necessarily get around to. It was late at night, and I thought this guy's performance leads perfectly into some discussions that I want to have throughout the week concerning fantasy college football. And that young man is Carson Beck. He generally had a fantastic game against one of the weaker teams in the SEC in Mississippi State. 36 of 48 passing, 459 yards, 3 touchdowns. Generally a very good game from a guy who's showing a lot of promise and could be the number 1 QB taken in the 2025 NFL Draft. But the reason why I mention the fact that some of these players have mistakes in this game and they want to be improved upon is because Carson Beck, as gaudy as those stats look and as good as they look on paper, I'm not even mentioning the 2 interceptions. He had 29.2 fantasy points, but the 2 interceptions are what stand out to me. And the score of that game as well stand out to me. Georgia won, but only by 10 points because a Mississippi State team they let hang around a little bit too much. This is a team that over the past couple of weeks hasn't had consistent enough performances to really make me think that if they get the CFP, they can truly contend for the national title again. Whether it was against Alabama, where it took them a half to figure things out, or now against Mississippi State, where they let them hang around late into the 4th quarter. This team really worries me. And it all stems from Carson Beck's play. Because as much as the stats look nice on paper, like I said, his erratic natures are really coming forth at the worst possible time. And it already cost him once against Bama. But you perhaps have the toughest closing schedule of any team in the SEC this season. This week you're going to Texas. You still have to play at Ole Miss. You still have to play, I believe, Tennessee. And who knows what your record's going to look like out of those 3 games. You could have 3 to 4 losses even. So Carson Beck's importance to this team is really shining through in the good and the bad moments for him. This performance generally was good, perhaps even great, but I can't look past the fact that if he is not consistent for this offense, it's not a good offense. You can exploit this offense way more than you could have 2 or 3 years ago. And the defense as well. So you're going to need a comprehensive performance from Carson Beck this weekend to truly let me believe that Georgia are true contenders and perhaps the biggest contender to Texas in the national title race. But for this week alone, I'm giving Carson Beck credit where credit is due for his stat line. For the running back position, Phil Mafah of the Clemson Bulldogs makes his return. Now, Phil Mafah has always quietly, to me, been one of college football's most impressive players. Because in that Clemson team, right, a team not necessarily built upon transfer portal additions or money, Phil Mafah completely embodies the Clemson identity of someone working his way into the system, being so effective, perhaps the most effective player for Clemson over the past couple of years, and cementing himself as perhaps one of the premier college football running backs in the nation. Really goes to show how Clemson have really turned their season around and turned the kind of cultural narrative of the past couple of months around as well for them. Because to start the season, they looked appalling against Georgia. But now, with this new and improved offense, the sky's the limit for Clemson, and Phil Mafah could be a big part of that. Because as much as we talk about Clay Klubnik, we also have to talk about Phil Mafah. 19 carries, 108 yards, 2 touchdowns, for a total of 23.6 fantasy points in this game for him. And when I think about Clemson going forward, they should have a manageable schedule, right? They still have to face, I believe, Pitt. They have a tough non-conference game against South Carolina. But for the most part, nobody on their schedule really scares you if you really look at it. So the important thing for the Clemson Bulldogs, the Tigers actually, I don't know why I said that. The Clemson Tigers, I'm sorry for that, another typo in my graphics. But the MO should be to keep on maintaining this offensive output from both of these players, in Cade Klubnik and Phil Mafah, because if Cade Klubnik continues to play well, then it opens up a lot of avenues for Phil Mafah. However, if Cade Klubnik kind of regresses back to what we expected out of him to start the season, then Phil Mafah could become the focal point of this Clemson offense. So it's really going to be a balancing act to both of these players. And Cade Klubnik has found himself on this Fantasy Stars list for several weeks now. So, looking at this Clemson team, I feel like this offense really can round into form and find a comfortability that will lead it far into the playoffs. And Phil Mafah could be at the center of it. But for now, he's just making his second straight appearance on my College Football Fantasy Stars of the Week list. At the wide receiver position, making his debut, is someone who you may not have ever heard of, especially me to at least start this season, but now might beginning to get known if his team stays the Big Ten race, and that is Pat Bryant. Illinois Fighting Illini. I needed all of his 104 yards and his touchdown, especially, and his 19.9 fantasy points for Illinois to escape a very weird game against Purdue where they seemed to be in control. But ultimately, Purdue took the lead, left a little bit too much time. Illinois kicked the field goal, went to overtime, scored a touchdown. Purdue scored it yet again, but then failed on the 2-point try. So a very bizarre Big Ten game for Illinois, but still, they remain in contention in the Big Ten. And not for nothing, that means that more high-profile games are in their future. I'm not sure who they play yet. I may just have to pull up their schedule here. But I do believe that if they can reach the Big Ten championship game as they play Michigan and Oregon in the next 2 weeks. 2 huge games for their Big Ten title hopes. I feel like someone on the offense is going to have to step up as well. Because, as much as I love Luke Altmaier, in these bigger games, I kind of expect him to lose his luster a little bit. Because he still is someone who is quite raw in his development as a college football quarterback. He's going to need weapons to rely upon. Pat Bryant's name has come up in Illinois circles as someone who could be that guy on the offensive side of the football. They have a couple injuries on the offensive side. I believe Caden Fagan, their running back, has gone down with an injury, might miss a couple of weeks. So it's going to be highly integral to incorporate at least some wide receivers in this team to get going. And so Pat Bryant is going to need to maintain this level of success we've seen in Big Ten play thus far in these next 2 games to really determine as Manic Particularity enters the chat as well. Welcome to you, my friend. I think that this game for him was very important, Pat Bryant, because it shows that Illinois can be a multi-dimensional team in the Big 12. And my last player that I want to highlight here, at least in this graphic, at the very least, had a very special performance for a player of his position. A very special performance. Tied the record for most catches by a tight end in college football with 17, had perhaps the highest yardage total of any tight end in the history of the sport. And that is Tyler Warren. This guy is someone who, for Penn State, I actually feel needs to have quieter games, and here's why. As much as I love a tight end who can elevate his team's offense and potentially be someone who can put up fantastic numbers and win you football games, that can't be the case going forward for Penn State. Because it's dangerous to rely on a tight end as perhaps your best player. And not for nothing, we've seen signs of improvement from this Penn State offense that go to show that they're more than just Tyler Warren. He was a special player, but at some point, he needs to understand that in order for this team to win, he might have to take the back seat a little bit. But this performance was much needed in this comeback effort against USC, and there may be more in his future. Who knows? 17 receptions, 224 yards, 1 touchdown, 37.7 fantasy points for him. But what I'm looking for out of Penn State most importantly is not just, consistent play from their best weapons, but play that carries over into the most important games. And we saw it this weekend against USC, where you needed a solid superstar performance from one of your best players, and it came from Tyler Warren. Now, if Penn State are to win the Big Ten, however, they need performances from the running backs, 2 of the best running backs in college football, and Nicholas Singleton and Kaytron Allen. They need it from Omari Evans, their young freshman receiver. They need it from Harrison Wallace, and they need it most importantly from Drew Aller. What I liked about Tyler Warren's performance was that it sprung an element of surprise, because he, much like Kmet, was involved in a lot of different things for the offense. But at the end of the day, Penn State are a weird team to diagnose right now because of the fact that their offense hasn't necessarily had one player who has been the main focus. Potentially that could be a good thing, but I'm worried about how it becomes too Tyler Warren-centric at some point, and they ultimately lose ground in the Big Ten race. But it's ultimately up to interpretation. But the last guy I want to mention here, not mentioned in my graphic here, is Gunnar Helm. And talk about superstar tight ends. 5 receptions, 91 yards, 1 touchdown, 17.6 fantasy points for him. Just going to show how versatile he can be for Texas in this kind of skill position group. Stacked at every single skill position Texas are. Gunnar Helm is proven to be someone who is a physical body on the field you have to account for if you're an opposing defense. And he can run roughshod over you and take control of a game if you give him the chance. So going forward, Gunnar Helmstar is only going to rise. And he's someone who I see as potentially a game wrecker in the playoff when Texas gets there. Because you can't necessarily account for someone of his size and his physicality at the tight end position. But let me know what you think about these college football fantasy stars as we transition back yet again to the world of NFL, making some bold fantasy predictions. Don't be surprised if someone makes its triumphant return. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about that. Don't go anywhere.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Ready for our fourth segment of the day here on the show. And it is a highly respected segment on the show. You guys seem to love this segment. Is my don't be surprised if they make some bold fantasy predictions ahead of NFL Week 7. A little bit earlier in the week than usual, but I just wanted to get my opinions out there. Let me know what you think of them in the comments if you feel so inclined. But without further ado, let's just jump right into them and get a little bit controversial in the show today. Start off, I feel like all of these predictions that I make are kind of centered around as Andre enters the chat, one of my favorite commenters of all time. Welcome to my friend. I feel like all of these predictions I make are predicated upon the flow of certain divisions, so to speak. I feel like this week especially, I took a lot of value in diagnosing specific divisional matchups that I feel like could dictate the week, and kind of talked about how certain units or certain players could make an impact on this game. So if you want to take stock in my predictions, you're very welcome to, but just know that where I find most of my kind of predictions stems from divisional matchups. So it's not always going to be the odd game here or there that you get every NFL weekend. It's going to mainly be about contentious matchups that actually really matter in the grand scheme of the season as well. But to start off with our first one of the Week 7 predictions, as Henri also says, thoughts on my parlay, just a three-legger. Brees 4 receptions, Josh Allen 30. Rushing, Braylon Allen 30 plus rushing. I think it's going to all come down to whether or not the new-look Jets offense can rely upon Brees Hall and Braylon Allen, right? Whether or not, changing from Nathaniel Hack to Todd Downing really changes anything about this Jets offense. Because if it doesn't, then Brees Hall and Braylon Allen might not be as effective as you want them to be. But I still feel like it can hit just because of the fact that Nets need a running game to truly improve as an offense. I feel like they're going to want to pinpoint that area tonight and focus on getting them as touchdowns as Rodgers over under 220 yards as well. I kind of feel like Rodgers is someone who, game in, game out, you don't really know what you're going to get out of him. So I feel like this game could see him throw a little bit more just because of potentially what they could have there. But if I'm right in diagnosing the Jets as someone who wants to focus on the run, then perhaps Rodgers might have to take a little bit of a back seat. And thus, that's what I can't really necessarily predict much about what the Jets are going to look like going forward, much less tonight. Because this whole surprise was really sprung on us so quickly that we couldn't have time to react to what the Jets could look like in a very important game, mind you. So I'm just going to say he's going to hit the under, but that's just because I feel like the Jets are going to try and diagnose as many problems tonight as they can in terms of getting this offense going. But going back to my predictions and talking about a divisional matchup that could spring a couple of surprises in terms of fantasy predictions. How about the Vikings and Lions and the Vikings defense potentially stymieing the Lions and being a top 5 defensive unit for the fantasy week? I feel like the thing about the Lions is that they're a very tough team to stop if you don't necessarily focus on the certain aspects of how they can beat you. As Andre also asks, would you trade Garrett Wilson and Olave for A.J. Brown? I feel like, not to kind of shed light on this trade in a negative way, but as I said, Lions are going to kill them. We'll see. This is just my ultimately prediction. I feel like the Vikings D have looked like one perhaps the best in the NFL. If you wanted to pick any defense to be the top unit this season. So I'm just basing it off of what I've seen, at least in the Vikings defense. But in terms of your trade request, not for nothing, I do feel like that trade could be plausible, even though it's a 2-player trade. But at the end of the day, I feel like, once, Derek Carr comes back for the Saints and Chris Olave comes back as well, as he left yesterday's game because of a concussion, I feel like they could find a rhythm again, because I feel like that's what they're going to want to predicate their offense on. And Garrett Wilson, I kind of feel like he's someone who is going to find a way to positively impact the game. And I feel like he's someone who's going to grow into the season as well. But for A.J. Brown, it's very tempting, because A.J. Brown is a very important part of that Eagles offense, as we saw in Philadelphia this weekend, beating the Browns. So I kind of feel like that trade could make sense, especially if you have a deep enough wide receiver room to account for those losses. But I'll leave it up to you, and good luck to you in your fantasy football exploits. As Ted Owner says, I like Conklin over 29.5 tonight. We'll see. I feel like he's someone who is Aaron Rodgers' one of his favorite targets this season in terms of his ability to adjust his routes. But because of that, I also feel like he's going to become someone who's just going to become a decoy in certain plays, in certain areas of the game. So it's going to highly depend on if they maintain a lot of what they were doing, or if it's a whole new game script. That's all I can really say about the Jets right now and any bets concerning them. But going back to my prediction about the Vikings defense, Brian Flores has certainly looked like one of the most creative defensive coordinators in his pressures. As Andre says, my receivers would be Jamar Chase, A.J. Brown, Brian Thomas Jr., and Josh Downs. So it's a deep enough wide receiver room where I feel like if you trade for A.J. Brown, then I feel like you'll be comfortable in having your 2 top receivers in Chase and A.J. Brown. And if guys like Brian Thomas Jr. breaks out, I think as well, I need help saving my fantasy team. CMC was coming back. Jordan Mason, I need to trade him somehow. He's my running back too. I feel like if you keep Mason, chances are he's going to be more of a detriment to your team than any benefits that he may have. I think that he still is someone who is going to truly benefit this team, but at the end of the day is not, someone I truly trust. I think that a CMC coming back adds a lot of value to your team, but I think that you might need to search the waiver wire a little bit to try and account for potentially losing a guy like Mason and trying to add some depth to that position, but we'll see. But let's get back to this segment here to quickly wrap it up. How about the Jets-Steelers? Sunday Night Football next week, hitting the under. And this is all before, of course, we see the Jets tonight. But I kind of feel like that game, if we look at it through a certain lens, feels like it's still, no matter what the Jets look like this week, will be a low-scoring game. And I can't see it going over, say, a 40, 45-point threshold because of the fact both of these defenses very solid. Both of these offenses are kind of unpredictable. This Tactical says CMC coming back anytime soon. What I will say is that I believe their timeline is hopefully looking at Week 7 for his return, which will be this week. But with that tendonitis issue, it's just highly difficult to really predict how he's going to look when he comes back. And so I don't know if they want to rush him back and keep him healthy and see how long they'll stick around in the NFC West, but it's worth mentioning that that injury is very tough to come back from. But let's get back into this segment here. The Jets Steelers in the under. I just feel like I'm sticking with that no matter what happens in tonight's game because of the fact that both of these defenses are so stellar and because of the unpredictability of their respective offenses as well. And then Daniel Jones. Here's my surprise prediction of the week. A top 10 fantasy QB in a divisional matchup with the Eagles this coming week. I know it's kind of silly after a dud of a performance we'll talk about in our next segment against the Bengals this past weekend, but I feel like Daniel Jones against this Eagles defense is going to pick and choose his spots, going to play very opportunistic football, mistake-free football, not necessarily the sexiest, but still a way to kind of control the flow of the game and potentially get into the end zone more often than not. I think that it's a pretty wacky kind of prediction to sum up what the Giants will look like next week, but I have full confidence that there will be some moments where Daniel Jones will have better games than we expect from him, especially like we saw against Seattle. So in this divisional matchup, I kind of feel like against a Eagles team that I'm really not moved by, he's going to have a big game. And the last one to round it off, how about Jaden Daniels and Andy Dalton being the best QBs of the weekend? The first part of this prediction could ring true, especially for Jaden Daniels after, even though losing to the Baltimore Ravens looking as efficient as ever. But the second part, with Andy Dalton being perhaps the best QB of the weekend, that's a little bit sketchy. But I do like how he matches up against this Commanders secondary. There are ways to exploit it, and I love how he's incorporating so many different receivers into his game plan. So look for Andy Dalton to be someone who can bring back a level of confidence to this Carolina Panthers team and make this competitive game against the Washington Commanders, because not for nothing, I have high hopes for him. Let me know what you think in the comments about this segment. Coming up next, though, as Andre said, rookies are taking over. I completely agree. I feel like, as Andre said, Bowers tight end 1. I don't know about Bowers. I feel like he might become the top target in Las Vegas should Devontae Adams finally leave, but we'll see. But you're very right in the fact that rookies are definitely going to dominate a lot of what I talk about over the rest of the NFL season. But we do have to take a short break. When we come back, I'm going to start my positional rankings with my top QBs for next week. Should be a good one. You don't want to miss it. We'll be right back after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back to our final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And to round off today's show, I'm going to start my positional rankings a little bit early this week. We're starting off with my QBs. Now, this list that I've compiled is very controversial. I'll just put it out there. I have two guys who you should expect to see at the top of a lot of fantasy QB rankings over weeks or certain weeks of the season. And then I have two guys who I'm really hoping I'll hit on this week into my prediction. They're long shots to really even start for you as well. But there's interesting options according to their matchups. Yet again, as always, I looked at all of the matchups for next week before this week's games were played. So, without further ado, let's talk about these 4 quarterbacks here. Starting off with a guy playing in tonight's game, Josh Allen. Next week, he's going to go up against the Titans. And I feel a game that should get him right back on track. If in tonight's game, he doesn't look like himself and the Jets win it. Because, not for nothing, if the Bills lose this game, I wouldn't necessarily panic if I were them. Because, yes, you lose first place in the AFC East, but you still have the same record as the Jets. And it's only your first divisional game. And you're in a situation where your schedule kind of lightens up a little bit. You have some manageable matchups throughout that you can hold off. If I pull up the Bills' schedule here, I feel like, especially this coming weekend over the next several weeks, they'll have some matchups to exploit before they get into the teeth of their AFC East schedule. They play the Titans, they play Seattle. Should be an interesting game. Then they play the Dolphins, Colts, before they play the Chiefs in about 4 or 5 weeks' time. So you have some easily manageable games if you're Josh Allen and co. And even if tonight's game doesn't go well, I'm fully confident that against a Titans team that, even though has looked scrappy at times, isn't necessarily a team you feel like can contend with a quarterback of Josh Allen's caliber. So, without any stats to back me up from tonight's game, I'm confidently saying that Josh Allen is going to be a guy you're going to want to start next week against the Titans. As Andre said, JD5 is my QB1 for Week 7. It's a good choice, to be honest with you. He is playing the Panthers, but I'm actually, at the end of this segment, going to shock you with my one of my personal picks that will finish pretty high in fantasy QB. But for the second pick here, my second kind of chalk pick here is Joe Burrow. Yes, he looked a little bit pedestrian, a little bit like he was going through the motions last night against the Giants. Only 19.82 fantasy points. I feel like the thing about Joe Burrow is that you never really worry about what he brings to the Bengals. It's going to be more about how the defense can fully bolster this offense and give it confidence. And last night they did very well in that regard in stopping the Giants. And yes, with the Giants offense, who week in, week out could look otherworldly one day and really pedestrian another, it was a solid performance for a unit that really needed it. And going forward, I feel like the defense is really going to elevate what the offense can do. Because if the defense gains confidence, then the offense can gain confidence as well. And this win, while very scrappy, kind of feels like it could get the Bengals season back on track. And going up against the Browns, who are a dumpster fire, you're potentially looking at 3 straight wins for a Bengals team that to start the season, not for nothing, could have had even more wins and could have had a winning record at this point of the season. So, in this game, expect Joe Burrow to put up big numbers in a Browns defense that still has the potential to have a big game, but because of its offense, really gets let down more often than not. So, let's say that Joe Burrow is going to be someone who you might want to choose for this contest, because at the end of the day, I feel like he's someone who I can't deny his talent in terms of helping this Bengals team. As Anya said, he's taking some fire. I agree with that as well. If every single weapon in that Bengals team plays to the best of their abilities, then you can say that the Bengals can be a playoff contender, even after such a poor start. And I feel like this team can just keep on getting better and better and better week in and week out. And so, I feel like T. Higgins could be a big part of that as well, because he's an underrated wide receiver. But at the end of the day, Joe Burrow, he's just going to see his star continue to rise in terms of how solid he is in fantasy and in real life. But now, here comes the weird and wacky decisions that I made in terms of looking at these QBs this week. These are the two guys who I said might raise a couple eyebrows if you're watching out there in terms of their fantasy outlook for this week. But they do have matchups that I feel that if they play their best football, they can exploit. Maybe they're not going to win their matchups or maybe win their games, but there are ways that I see these two guys playing that really could make them stand out as potentially in a deeper league a QB2 option you're comfortable with having. The first one being a guy we already mentioned, a guy who's gotten a lot of talk surrounding him on the show over the past couple of weeks, Daniel Jones. Yesterday, to say he underperformed after a solid performance against my Seattle Seahawks was an understatement. So I guess that it takes the Seahawks to bring the best out of Daniel Jones, I guess. But I digress. Going up against the Eagles, though, this is a sneaky, interesting matchup here. Because I actually predicted on Friday that Deshaun Watson would have a decent game against the Eagles this week. And not for nothing, he actually did. As Andre said, May should have a day with the Jacks. We'll talk a little bit more about May tomorrow. But I did like what I saw out of Drake May. And Patriots fans should be excited about that, despite the fact he had a couple turnovers in this game. It was what you expected, but he did have some impressive plays that really made him stand out for the Patriots offense. But going back to what I said about this Eagles defense and how you can exploit it. Deshaun Watson, not for nothing, looked quote-unquote competent in that game against the Eagles. And Daniel Jones, not for nothing, is someone who actually can have a game plan centered around him, unlike Deshaun at this point in time, where he can exploit this Eagles secondary. Because let's not forget that the Eagles are a team that's giving up the 6th most yards on defense to anyone. And so, in a weird divisional matchup, look for Daniel Jones to potentially be someone who can bring a certain level of competence to the Giants, especially if Malik Neighbors comes back as well, because he's going to be a huge factor in how they play. But at the end of the day, don't rule out Daniel Jones, especially in deeper leagues, just because, he had a down performance, because he is definitely a boom or bust kind of guy, a peaks and valleys guy, as they say. But in this matchup, I wouldn't be surprised if he puts together a couple of good drives, gets a couple of touchdowns in this game, and at the end of the day, has a good stat line in both real life and fantasy. So, it may sound crazy, but it's just my opinion. And the other guy I also kind of mentioned in my last segment as well, Andy Dalton, going up against the Commanders. Now, this matchup is highly unlike the Ravens matchup, where both of these guys are dual threat guys, and that you're not expecting Andy Dalton to do anything with his legs. What he can do with his arm is really challenge a Commander's secondary that doesn't necessarily handle speed well. And Deontay Johnson has played very well with Andy Dalton as his QB, as well as Xavier Legette, another guy who's a solid speed guy, but more of a multifaceted route runner as well. But when I look at Andy Dalton, what he's done as a QB in both real life and fantasy, he's been someone who, not for nothing, I feel like a lot of people can rely upon. He did only have 14.94 points against Atlanta. Had a weird up and down day where he threw 2 touchdowns, threw 2 picks. But I feel confident that in certain matchups, Andy Dalton can do enough to really create a narrative that he can be, at least in a deeper league, a starting fantasy QB. Because he just is someone who, at the end of the day, I would feel comfortable relying upon to generate enough offense, generate enough competent drives for a Carolina Panthers squad, because he really has rejuvenated it. But it's just about, finding the certain matchups where I best see him fitting that kind of narrative for fantasy football managers. But let me know what you think in the comments, because that will just about do it for today's show. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you all for your wonderful comments. Continue leaving them if you so choose to interact with the show directly. It just makes it that much better, and it's greatly appreciated by all concerned at the show and the network as well. Like, follow, and subscribe if you do feel so inclined, but we'll be back here tomorrow, same time as always, 3:30 p.m. Eastern, for another great show. Other than that, I've been Chris Shepard, and I'm out. As Andre said, Schuber is the player that shot me the most. As he says, he's unreal. Thank you for that comment, Andre, but we do have to finish the show. Thank you, and